So, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Catherine Zack. This is Beyond Balance, and it is so nice to meet you. Thank you for listening along so far. Otherwise, it's just me having half a conversation from my office slash my kids' playroom on the other side of this camera. And like any real life conversation, it's important to get a sense of who it is that is having the conversation. So, if we haven't yet met officially, I wanted to use this episode to share a bit more about myself and my story. Quite simply, for at least two reasons. One being that it's good to have an idea of who it is that you're listening to, who it is you're in conversation with, to create some context for the podcast. Like, who is this lady who's sitting here telling me about something beyond balance on the other side of burnout? So I want to give you context for the podcast, and also, kind of selfishly, I really want to get to know you. So this episode is basically me going first with the sincere hope that you will continue to share more about who you are, how you are showing up today. And again, I want to meet you exactly where you are, not some like kind of perfect down the road one day version of yourself. I'm showing up like I am, and I'm always inviting you to do the same. So I'll include a link in the show notes about where you can start to have that conversation with me, how you can share a little bit more about yourself. And I will read happily every word that you send my way. And I can't wait to meet you all. Thank you. Thank you for being here and listening and making this a two-way conversation with me. So before I dive all into my story, let's talk about story. It can be a powerful teaching tool. Story can be a powerful teaching tool. And even better, story can be a tool for real connection. For as long as time itself, people have been sharing and learning through story, building community and identity and belonging through story. So, sharing a story, whether it's an archetypal myth or someone's memoir, which is a form that I love to read, or a really revelatory and intimate song that someone's written, or even just very simply a podcast episode like this one, there's this sense that through story, we can see each other, like we can see and be seen. Like listening to a bit perhaps of what I have to share in this episode as my story might make you think at some points like, yeah, I see myself there. I really see myself there. And now that I see myself in this story, I perhaps don't feel as bad about this messy part of my life, because I'm not alone. That's the power of story. That's the power of story as a teaching tool, as a connection tool. And that's really a win for story as a tool. One of my dearest and most beloved books to reread again and again and again is a book called Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation. And it's by a man named Parker Palmer. And he's in his 80s now, which is a decade that I like to collect wisdom from. He's a writer, a podcast host in his own right. He's a Quaker, he's an activist, he's an educator, he's a magical storyteller. But in this book, Let Your Life Speak, he talks about story and the power of story as a way to learn about each other. But he also gives a really important caveat that I also want to state here. And he writes something like this. I have the quote right here. He says, "The story of my journey is no more or less important than anyone else's. It is simply the best source of data I have on the subject where generalizations often fail, but truth may be found in the details." So I will share Isn't that good? By the way, isn't that he's so good? So I will share the details of my own story, not because it is any more or less important than anyone else's, but because it's the best source of data that I have on the subject. That is the Beyond Balance podcast, and I think it's key to remember that, and it's key to remember that because stories can really fail us when they make us feel bad about ourselves. Right. when we start like creating a hierarchy of stories of some being better or more important or less important than others. And also when we see like a bright, shiny after in someone else's story, or when we try to emulate the stories that we hear and we don't get to the same result. Right. And because we can't really, because it's not our story. So along those same lines, I am also currently reading a book by Padraig Otuma called In the Shelter, Finding a Home in the World. And this is a little clue for you too. If nothing else, this podcast is like book recommendation after book recommendation after book recommendation. So that might be why you're listening. It's one of the reasons that I love to listen to podcasts. But this book, In the Shelter, he also talks about story and how, again, it's a powerful teaching tool, but there are just caveats that we can listen with that I think make the listening experience richer and a little bit more nuanced and textured. And this is what he writes. He says, he's talking about story, he's talking about testimony as a certain kind of story. And he says, it is a moving thing to listen to the testimony, but testimony, if told or heard unwisely, can be a colonization of a single experience into a universal requirement. And so, yeah, it's the same kind of nuanced caveat is that in no way do I want you to listen to my story and think that it's a universal experience, or that if you if we get up to some of the things that I'm talking about here, that you'll end up in the same place. I want you to end up in your place. And yeah, and I think just because something worked for me doesn't necessarily mean that it will work for you, doesn't mean that it won't. But if there's a way that I can share this story and you can listen to this story and you can share your story in return, that we can do that beyond kind of understanding of this is right or wrong or good or bad or successful or this is a failure or I'm a failure. If I try these things and it doesn't work out the same, then that's how I'll offer this story, right? The 13th century Sufi poet Rumi has a line somewhere that goes like, there is a field out beyond right doing and wrong doing. I'll meet you there. Right. I'll meet you there. I'll meet you in Rumi's proverbial field, but beyond right doing and wrong doing. With all those disclaimers in mind, I'm still a lawyer at heart. I will share my story in that way and in that place. So thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. So where to begin? As with all of us, there are kind of natural starting points to a story. One is chronological, start at the beginning. Very good place to start. Another approach is to visit the kind of big benchmarks of a life, the births, the deaths, the graduations, the career changes, the marriages, the divorces, that kind of thing. And you'll hear that in my story. You'll hear both the chronological approach and you'll hear those kind of big benchmark moments, these familiar forms. But I'm also using a narrative tool of questioning, of asking a question, and I'll give you that question in a moment, of contemplation to help guide the story along. And really, as first and foremost, a way for me to understand my own story, and perhaps as a way for you to understand yours too. So, this kind of questioning tool as an organizing principle for the story that I'm about to share, it's certainly a nod to that Socratic method teaching technique that terrorized us all in law school, but that is brilliant. And the question that I'm working with as my organizing tool that I'll share with you is something like this. In this moment, and in any particular moment of the story, did I belong to my life? In this moment, did I belong to my life? Did I feel at home in my own life? That is the story that is the question that propels this story. And it's one that we can ask at the benchmark moments to be sure. Like you're standing at the altar wondering, is this my decision? But it's also one that we can ask every day. And it's one that is worth asking every day. It's one that I'm still asking myself each day as a way to check in, to take stock, to take a kind of daily inventory so as not to wake up one day and wonder, how the heck did I get here? Whose decisions are these anyways? And I'm jumping ahead a little bit in the story, but and this is a question that I think again is worth sharing and worth perhaps getting up to in your own life if you're not doing something like this already, just to check in every day in a really simple way to notice, like, do I feel at home in my life? And it's because, these benchmark moments are things we can point to that are nice and shiny and we can hang them on our walls. But it's truly the kind of everyday quality of a life that makes a life, right? The writer Annie Dillard has a wonderful line that I come to again and again and again. And it's something like, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. So this story is offered with that contemplation at the forefront. On any given day, what is the response to the question, the self-inquiry? Do I belong to my life? Am I at home in this life? So the earliest moments that I can remember belonging to my life, to feeling at home in my life, is as a precocious young girl growing up in a small town in northeastern Pennsylvania. And in my earliest moments, I can see my kind of birthright gifts, if you will. They were something like sitting quietly with curiosities and the big questions, like, what is the meaning of this life? And being surrounded by all of my books and all of my papers and all of my notebooks, and just kind of quietly sitting in my room and imagining the beautiful and useful things that I hoped to one day design. And those things really were more like ideas that I was hoping to share, questions I was hoping to ask communally. And so in this way, and kind of from an inside out perspective, I was really feeling at home in my own life, like feeling at home in what I came here to do, kind of naturally aligning my outer actions to the kind of inner call that was telling me, what my life was there to do, what my life was there to do. So I felt at home in my life from the inside out, and also on the outside, I was starting to pick up on the clues of what the world thought about me too. Right? And you might pause here too and kind of remember an early instance for yourself. What were some of the early moments where you realized that the world had an opinion about what you were doing and what your own inner voice was telling you to do? And quite simply, I did really well in school. I was kind of a reading, writing, history, liberal arts academic. So from the outside in, I was getting all of this external validation too, because I did well in school. And it's funny to think about those boxes that we get put in from the world around us. And it's like quite the distinction that I was a liberal arts academic and not a math and science academic, or certainly not an athlete. That was, if you know me, that's very apparent. But actually, it's an interesting point in this story to pause, because I was, not in that athletic box. And I really hated gym class. Like really hated, could not get through a kickball game to save my life. And um, I had a just hip enough gym teacher in the late 90s in my little town in Pennsylvania, my Catholic school. And she let those of us who did not enjoy kickball go into a room. I think it was like the wrestling room off the gym. And she wheeled in one of those like metal stands with a really big boxy TV, probably from the 1980s on it. And do you remember those big metal stands in high school with wheels that wheeled in the big boxy TVs? And she wheeled in this big boxy TV and a VHS player, and she put on a yoga tape. And so that was my first kind of exposure to a formal way of asking questions, practicing yoga, and also getting clued in a little bit to meditation. So that's kind of how I found my way to this moment too, is that not being an athlete and hating kickball. So thank you to that gym teacher for wheeling in that TV on that day. So I'm a dreamer and I'm an admirer of big thinkers, and I'm doing yoga in the wrestling room. And it's also the late 90s. And so I'm dating myself a little bit here as a very old millennial, but like many young girls my age, I also loved Carrie Russell's show Felicity. Anyone watch that? And it takes place in New York City. And so I really wanted to move to New York City. And more specifically, I wanted to go to college. I wanted to go to NYU. That was my dream I think from the time I was 12. I got that notion in my head. And again, as a liberal arts academic who was doing well in school and getting all kinds of external validation signs, checking all the right boxes, always doing the next right thing. And that's what I call that, the next right thing syndrome. I definitely had that. But I was still aligned to what my inner compass was telling me to do. So it was a nice kind of mix of inner and outer knowing. And so all the kind of stars aligned in that way. And I ended up at NYU in the early 2000s, which was an exciting, amazing time to be in New York City. Kind of a very pivotal time, not too far after 9/11. And I just found that the city itself and the people I was meeting were astonishing. Like I think I literally had rock stars in my class at NYU. Like the people who were there during that time have gone on to do amazing things. It's been so fun to watch them. So it was inspiring. And I was getting exposed to so many things that I would not have if I hadn't gone. And I was taking it all in. I was taking it all in and taking a lot of classes. And it was hard for me to choose a major. I didn't show up in college knowing exactly what I wanted to study, exactly what I wanted to do. So I didn't just pick one, I picked two majors. The first, I was a gender and sexuality major at NYU, which was astonishing coming from a small town in Pennsylvania and Catholic school for my whole life. And that was a breathtakingly interdisciplinary department where I got to read books about critical race theory and works from women of color and transgender people. And I also paired this with a political science major that was very heavy on political theory and the history of theory. So again, asking big questions. And like a lot of liberal arts academics with those two majors, I was nearing the end of college and wondering, well, what do you do with these two things? And so I answered that question in a way, yeah, that a lot of liberal arts academics answer that question, which is, well, you go to law school. And this wasn't totally out of left field. My father is a lawyer, and my grandfather was a lawyer, and so it was kind of in the family blood there to do something like this. So now it's not so much my inner knowing, that question of like, do I belong to this decision? Not so much that landed me in law school, and now it's more like momentum and external validation that's starting to drive that decision to end up in law school. And on the one hand, I did belong to that decision because I got to spend more time in school in a place that I love to be, in that kind of academic and rigorous setting, and a place where we learned by asking questions. Again, that was that Socratic method, a place where I got to read and read and read and think and analyze and write and argue, which is definitely a part of my personality too, believe it or not. But it really was that momentum rather than the sense of belonging to my life that starts to take over as an organizing principle at this point in my story. Um, because, you get a lot of congratulatory looks and words when you graduate from NYU with a bunch of honors and you're on your way to Ivy League law school. Like, people just know what to do with you. They just know how to respond to you, right? Like, oh, that's impressive. That is very straightforwardly successful. Good job. So I was collecting a lot of external validation that these were good choices, at least according to, a kind of commonly accepted set of beliefs. These were good choices. And I always say this, and it's still true. I was as sure about my decision to go to law school as I was of my decision to leave the practice of law several years later. Right? I was as sure of the decision to start on this path as I was when I decided to get off it. The distinction, though, is really that the source of the surety. Right. So my decision to go to law school was very much driven by a sureness that I got by looking outside of me for external nods of approval. Yes, keep going, keep doing the next right thing, keep checking the next right box. You're doing a good job. So very much that's where that surety, that's where that confidence came from, collecting it from, approval from people around me. And then the surety to leave the law came from a very different source, came more from that question that I led with at the beginning of like, do I belong to my life? Am I at home in my life? And so that was the kind of compass that I used to make that decision to leave several years later. So I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I ended up in law school in Philadelphia after graduating from NYU. And this is where the distinction really starts to happen, this external kind of validation and using that as a compass versus this internal sense of belonging to my own life. So on paper, it's looking really good, right? Still checking all the right boxes, taking the right classes, ending up in the right top third of my class, getting onto the journals and doing all of the extracurricular activities, getting the right summer jobs and kind of acing my on-campus interviews, things like that. So on the outside, it's looking really good. My life on paper is looking really good. My resume is getting, longer and shinier by the moment. But on the inside, I am increasingly not feeling at home in this life that I'm creating. Right? I'm not feeling like I belong to these decisions that I keep making. And moments that jump out at me that start to clue me into like there's some dissonance here between the inside and the outside are like when in law school I learned that the only right decision or the only right answer to the question, how are you, is I'm swamped, right? I'm just so busy. I'm going to have to pull another all-nighter tonight. These I started to learn are the acceptable responses to the question, how are you? That if you emblazon this badge of busyness across your chest, people will know how to respond to you. It's validated. That is powerful currency in certain circles, this badge of busyness that you are swamped, that you have so much on your plate and you're not going to sleep until it's done. Right. So I'm starting to sense that this is an external driver. This is an organizing principle for the decisions I'm making, and it's not feeling great. And also at this time, you're just as likely to find me in the law library as you are in a yoga classroom or a meditation classroom, because that's also what I was filling whatever kind of spare time I had. That's how I spent it. And I was achieving, excelling, and accomplishing on the outside. But on the inside, I was beginning to suffer from debilitating anxiety and stress, right? I was experiencing panic attacks that pretty much took me down. I pretty much stopped eating and sleeping in law school. Um, really stopped eating and sleeping. I think I lost, I don't know, 30 pounds or something in that time. 30 pounds I probably didn't have to lose. And my stress and my anxiety and my need to keep this life on paper looking really good was literally eating away at me. I remember one time sitting on my couch in my apartment in Center City, Philadelphia, and my heart was beating out of my chest. And I called my parents, and I literally thought I was going to die. I felt like I was dying, and they rushed down, and we went to the emergency room, and I got no real answers. Right, I was fine. Like my vitals were fine. My anxiety calmed down. The panic attack ended, and rather than getting some kind of information about what was happening to me or how I could better take care of myself, the answer I kind of got was, yeah, I mean, grad school's hard, law school's hard. Suck it up. You'll survive or you won't. Right. So that's the kind of message I was getting with what to do with this kind of chronic sense of stress and anxiety and overwhelm and panic and burnout. That's the message I was getting from the outside is suck it up. Right. You'll survive or you won't. You'll do it or you won't. And I did. I graduated in that top third of my class, and I sat for the New York bar, and I moved to Washington, D.C. to take a job as a litigation associate at one of the top firms in the country. Right? I did it. I did it. I did it on paper. And the short version of this is something like the external life looks good on paper, but the second I picked up the hood, the proverbial hood of my life, and looked underneath it, I had an overwhelming sense of I don't belong here. Right? I wouldn't have chosen this for myself. These are not the choices that I would make from the inside out if I was living my life from the inside out. And so finally, a couple years into practicing law, I picked my head up and I looked around, and I realized that to be overwhelmingly true. And it was a voice and a truth that I couldn't not listen to. Right? So I started to use a different compass. And that was that question again: do I belong to my life? Do I belong to my life, as a process for making decisions and eventually making really big changes? And I did it in a very granular, day-to-day kind of way. And I encourage you to do the same if you're sensing like, this feels familiar, what she's describing. To really ask yourself this question on a day-to-day kind of way. So I started to realize that on the day-to-day, I did not like being an adrenaline junkie litigator at a top law firm. Like, I actually felt like my nervous system was constantly struck on high. I was constantly in a fight or flight mode, and I did not want to spend my days that way. Again, coming back to that Annie Dillard quote, like, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. And so I didn't like the way it felt, always having to worry about whether a Friday fire drill would land on my desk at 5 p.m. And it usually did. I didn't like waking up in the morning and glancing at my BlackBerry and that red light blinking like to all the messages that had come in overnight. Again, I'm kind of dating myself here. We had a BlackBerry. And it just, it didn't feel good from the inside out to be in this life, even though on paper it was still looking great. And I also noticed the places where I did feel good, And again, that was in the meditation room and the yoga room. And I was really deepening my study of meditation and these kind of mindfulness modalities. And I was also starting to teach meditation and mindfulness, and that felt really good. And so the day-to-day quality is now starting to align my external decisions to the internal voice that I'm again starting to listen to. And I'm really simplifying this and I'm condensing quite a bit, but all of this led me to the wild moment of waltzing myself down the hallway to the managing partner's office at my law firm at the beginning of 2014 and saying, "Thank you so much for all you have invested in me and all the opportunities that I've had here. But I am now leaving the practice of law for the practice of meditation." Like, if I could just go back and be a fly on the wall for that conversation. But finally, this decision felt like my own. Right? It felt like it belonged to me. It felt like it was going to lead me to a place where I would feel at home in my life once again, even though it was wildly uncertain, mildly terrifying. It was something I couldn't not do. Even if I couldn't quite explain it to myself, and I certainly couldn't explain it to the people around me, who were like, "What are you doing?" Bless my parents. So this is the major turning point in my story, because nearly everyone around me thinks that I have lost my mind, is totally disapproving of this decision, but I have this core of unshakable confidence and knowing and trusting that this was in fact the right decision for me, even though there were no guarantees. There were no more fancy job titles. I had to take my shiny diplomas down from the wall. But I knew that if I didn't listen to this, if I didn't have this kind of unshakable inner voice that was giving me confidence, I would have never left. Right? If I was still looking to only external signs of validation about this decision, I would probably be a partner at that law firm. I'd have 100 pairs of high heel shoes and a lot of money, and I would not feel at home in my life. Simple as that. Right. So this is another caveat I'll put in here too. It's like, I'm telling no one to go quit their corporate jobs. I'm not telling you that. Your parents would have my head. They'd come knocking down my door. But of course, you don't need me to tell you that, because so many of you are already quitting. We are, in fact, in the middle of the great resignation, right? So you're getting clued into this as well. And because this is the moment that I find myself sharing this story with you, my own great resignation now, almost 8 years ago, I think this is the place that I want to pause. I want to pause in the telling of the story. It feels like a good place to pause, even though there's still 8 years of life that I can't wait to share with you soon, a couple episodes down the line. I want to pause because I want to create some space for you to listen for your own story, right? To make some space to sit with that question. In this moment, am I at home in my life? Do I belong to the decisions that I'm making? Do the decisions that I'm making belong to me? Or are they someone else's? And one of the best ways I know to kind of open the junk drawer of our mind and kind of wonder, like, who put this in here? Is this my decision? Is, of course, through meditation, through creating that literal space to just sit quietly and listen. And before we move into the meditation practice in just a moment, I'll come back to that book that I started with at the top of the podcast, that Parker Palmer book, Let Your Life Speak. And he's got some really great advice about how we can listen, how of we can listen to what our life is telling us in this moment. And he says that so often we approach ourselves in this kind of adversarial and aggressive way. Like, why? And I do this too. I still do this. Why haven't you figured this out already? We yell to ourselves silently. But he says that, the source of the answers that we're really looking for is the soul. And the soul does not respond well to cross-examinations and subpoenas. So we have to take a different approach. He says that the soul is like a wild animal. Right? And if you've ever gone to some place wild, even just the woods, to see a wild animal, you know that if you come in there hollering and screaming and thrashing around, you're going to scare everything off, right? You will see nothing, you will find nothing. So we have to go in quietly, and we have to be patient, and we have to sit, sit and wait and listen and watch and be still and be quiet. And Parker Palmer writes, only then will we catch a glimpse of the precious wildness that we seek. And the precious wildness that we seek is really the answer to that question. Do I belong to my life? Am I at home in my life in this moment? So let's sit together. Let's sit quietly together. Take a moment to kind of shake off whatever you have been doing, to pause, and whatever it is that you're multitasking with. We do it. I do it too. And see if you can make yourself supremely comfortable. You can sit somewhere, you can even lie down. And as you start to settle in, you can fidget, you can wiggle, you can move around. So that as you land, as you start to slow down the movements, you can land in a way that feels as comfortable as it will get right now, as comfortable as it will get. See if you can let the weight of your body settle into the support beneath you, the chair beneath you, the bed beneath you, the floor beneath you, wherever you are. See if you can, for just a moment, not need to hold yourself up, not need to hold it all together. Like you could relax into this place that you are, like you could let the muscles soften away from the bones and the bones be heavy, almost like you were softening into or melting into a delicious hug, like the way you could let yourself be held in a wonderful hug. And you might close your eyes if you haven't already. Relax your jaw, take a few deep breaths. And with every exhale, this sense of softening a bit more, of letting yourself just land exactly where you are in this moment. And you might find that the mind is a loud and busy place, and see if you can just listen to what it is that you are hearing there without needing to change it or fix it or solve a problem in this moment. And see if you can simply listen and be with, not need to do anything about, the thoughts that come and the emotions that you feel in this moment, perhaps whatever it is that you notice. Can you be with it? Can you listen to it? Can you listen for it without needing to change a thing, without calling it right, without calling it wrong, without naming it a success or naming it a failure? Can you be with what you find in the next few quiet moments, just like this? If it's not there already, you might take a hand and place it across your heart. Feel the beat of your heart. This very literal, tangible way of coming back to yourself, of coming home to yourself. A hand to the heart's the simplest way back that I know. And with your hand there, you can take the deepest breath that you've taken all day in through your nose and hold it at the very top. And when you need to let it go, open the mouth and exhale, exhale, exhale. And a few times like that, deep breath in through the nose and hold. And deep breath out from the mouth. And this final breath, final moment of quiet, you ask and listen. Do I belong to my life? Do I belong to myself? Right now, in this moment, do I feel at home in my life? And this is a place you can come back to again and again and again and again. These questions are here for you every day. So as you come back into your day and come back into your doing, visit the link in the show notes below. I would love to hear what's coming up for you when you ask yourself that question. Do I belong to my life? Am I at home here? I want to hear your stories too. I want to know who you are, how you're showing up, what you're here for, questions you might have, places you want to go together in this conversation of the Beyond Balance podcast. I'll be waiting. I can't wait to read your responses and to begin a conversation with you. So till next time, my friends. Thank you for listening. This is Beyond Balance. I am Catherine Zack. You know a little bit more about me now, and I can't wait to learn about you too. So thank you, thank you, thank you. That's a wrap.